Thank you very much for the floor, Bogdan. I'm just going to put on my timer so I don't go run over time. So thank you very much for being here, to listen to my discussion, and a big thank you as well to the Center for European Studies for the funding which actually made this trip possible. So as Bogdan did say, I'm a second-year PhD student in the Department of Anthropology here at UF, and this trip, which actually took place last year, really is based on what I want to do in terms of my research, which is really analyzing the perceptions and responses to the EU external migration policies in the Langue de Barbarie, Senegal, which is actually, just an extension of the city of Saint Louis, right? So Saint Louis, but I'll obviously go into that in a little bit more detail during this presentation, right? So, just prior to going to Senegal last year, June, I actually received, like I said, I received funding from the Center for European Studies to attend the Hope Conference, which was held in Sevilla, Spain, from the 3rd to the 6th of June, right? So this is the Hope Congress was organized by the Jesuit University in the 21st century, and this is the theme, a project of hope for the world, right? And this was a congress that was held at Universidad Loyola in Andalusia in Sevilla, in the Sevilla campus. So prior to this congress, a couple of colleagues from here at UF and at Universidad Loyola, we worked on a paper which is entitled Bridging Borders, so migration aspirations, imaginaries, and lived experiences from the global south, right? So one of the things that we were really talking about in this paper was to kind of compare, perhaps even contrast, the imaginaries and the way people perceive life in the global north, right? So Latin Americans, would obviously, we were looking at, like, as I say, the Americas vis-a-vis the United States, and then Africa vis-a-vis Europe, right? And we were looking at the importance of these imaginaries, these networks, and how these, build bridges between, for example, migrants who have migrated and then their communities back home, right? So it's a lot of this is a lot to do with transnational migration, right? And so following from that, we actually are developing a paper which has been accepted. We are just basically refining it right now. And the title of this paper, which actually builds up on the abstract that we presented at the Loyola conference, was Bridging Borders, so migration imaginaries, social connections, and lived experiences from the global south, right? So that will be coming, and once it is approved and everything, then I'll share it with you, right? So as mentioned, this presentation is really based on this preliminary field site visit along the Langue de Barbarie in Saint Louis, Senegal, right? The purpose of this trip was really to see if it is feasible, right? And as Bogdan did say, and I did the MDP, the Masters of Sustainable Development Practice here at UF, and I did field work in Senegal in 2023. And one thing that I must say is that, first and foremost, that this research that I'm doing builds on that research that I did started in the masters. So it was not my first time going to Senegal, but I will explain it, during the presentation, that the ambiance was very different in Senegal compared to last year. And vis-a-vis the first trip that I did there in 2023. And this is partly because of, the migration policies, or the intensifying of these stringent migration policies that are being implemented to curb migration from transit countries, such as Senegal, right? And so it's looking at the local perceptions and responses to Spain and Senegal's intensified bilateral cooperation between vulnerable migrants, with the intention, rather, of protecting vulnerable migrants, preventing deaths at sea, and tackling criminal networks in order to curb this migration, right? So this bilateral cooperation highlights the EU's externalization approach towards the management of irregular migration from Africa towards Europe, right? So some of the academics will talk about the external, or how can I say, the business of bordering Europe, right? I mean, Europe has its borders, but it's now it's a question of extending those borders all the way into Africa so that we can curb this migration, right? However, what I'm trying to really argue with this research, amongst other things, of course, is that the obsession with security and curbing migration, and all of that does not actually address the underlying causes of irregular migration, right? So that is really it. So for me, for us, for example, we are really looking at trying to see what are the human elements about migration. Because even though, for example, these policies are being implemented, there's weaponization of the of borders, right? It's not necessarily stopping migration. It's not necessarily going to the root cause of migration, right? So anyway, whilst I was in, so perhaps I'll begin with also a little bit of a story, right? As anthropologists, what do? We talk a lot. We tell stories, right? And so, I'm going to talk a little bit about a story that I experienced, or an experience rather, that I had whilst in Cordoba, right? Cordoba, Spain. So, like I said, I was in Sevilla, but then I had the opportunity to visit the Universidad Loyola's campus in Cordoba. And whilst I was waiting for a friend, I was just doing observations. I was just waiting. And I saw there was this young gentleman on a bench. And for me, he looked like he was from West Africa, but I couldn't really tell. And then after a while, I said, perhaps he's from Senegal. Now, why do I say Senegal? Why do I say West Africa? Why was this all interesting for me? It's like, obviously, because it's of my research, right? But what was interesting about this young fellow who was there is that he wasn't talking to anybody, right? And it's clearly there was just something about him that he just felt at unease. And so, I put on my researcher hat and I sat next to him, and he was like, "Why are you sitting next to me?" But anyway, after a while he didn't really mind. And then, he was on his phone and he started playing some music from Senegal. I didn't know it, but I just, listened to the vibe, and I'm like, this is probably from Senegal. And I said to him, "Are you from Senegal?" And he looked at me as if like he'd seen a ghost. It's like, "Yeah, like, how do you know?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, no, I've been to Senegal." And he literally, it's as if he had seen a ghost. And he's like, "No, you haven't been to Senegal." And then I said to him, "Well, yes, I have. And two, I'm going to go there on Monday." And he says, "You're joking to me." And he just couldn't believe it. And then I said to him, "So, what's your story? I mean, how did you get here? We all have a story." And then he says to me, "Oh no, you know, I suppose that the connection to Senegal and everything kind of made him feel that he could trust me." And he says, "Oh, I came here by barco, barco, a boat." I'm like, "Oh, what kind of boat?" I'm playing dumb. "What kind of boat?" And he said, "No, irregular migration." And so he says to me, "Look, it's the first time that somebody's sitting next to him, who's not from his friends, who is sitting next to him. So, I mean, for him, I mean, even though I'm mixed race and everything, but for him, I pass as European. And he says, it's so nice for somebody to come and sit next to me. And he says that he's having problems with the language. He's not allowed to work. And, his testimony kind of like made me think about, I'm like, but back in Africa, the perception of Europe is so different, you know? And so I said to him, "Look, as I said to you, I'm going to go to Senegal on Monday. Um, I'll call you when I'm in Senegal." And we took each other's numbers and everything. And I called him from Senegal. The guy says to me, "You're so lucky to be in Senegal. You are eating good food in Senegal. And here I am in Europe." Right. And so it kind of it makes you think, because it's like a lot of the youth kind of have these imaginaries about migration. These, when they're on social media, they're seeing this beautiful life, El Dorado, this paradise. And the lived experiences of migrants when they reach Senegal is different, right? So I think that was really something that like kind of got me thinking about this whole thing about migration, right? So yeah, so basically this is as I said also in the into the introduction, um, and another thing as well is that the significance of this research really wants to highlight how African communities are impacted by these bilateral agreements, right? Because we're always thinking about the global north, or Europe, EU. They are really making a lot of these migration policies, but not necessarily consulting people on the ground, right? It's always this fear, this exodus, this the need to contain or to control the migration, right? But how are people actually experiencing it on the ground? Because you all will probably know better than I that in terms of policies, there's always this disconnect between the people who sit, within the EU compared to what's going on the ground. What are the realities on the ground? So these are some of the things that I want to kind of focus on. Is like the more grounded level, a grounded approach to research of policy, and and those people who experience that policy who live on the ground, right? Another thing that I've also, since going to the field last year, is I really want to try and underscore the importance of language and social linguistics in human migration, discourse around the migrant, right? Because as mentioned previously, I mean, when we think about the how the migrant is framed within the global north, and well, let me just speak about Europe. There's this criminal, there's this fear mongering that the migrant is dangerous. Also, something that is very important is that, even within the language, if we speak about irregular migration or illegal migration, when we say that that a migrant is engaging in illegal migration, um, is that really illegal? And a lot of academics are starting to ask that question, because all they basically did is they crossed a border without the correct documentation. But does that really make them illegal per se? And if we are going to label the migrant as illegal, um, because of an act, it criminalizes the migrant, but then also at the same time dehumanizes, the migrant, right? And so when you dehumanize the migrant, you basically deprive the migrant of their rights. And I used to work in the International Organization for Migration, which is the UN Agency for Migration. And the big question that we always used to ask is, well, we would obviously advocate that irregular migrants, migrants, whether they're irregular or regular, have rights even when they are in detention centers, right? And if you go to a lot of these detention centers, there are a lot of cases of human rights abuses, and there are many organizations who are actually documenting the lack of human rights which should be afforded to migrants, right? Another thing about this research is that it touches a lot on political economy, because I'll talk talk more about it in a bit. But within Senegal, I mean, we have a lot of extractive industries that are operating, be it within the fishing sector, be it within oil and gas exploration, right? There's also climate change that is occurring within Senegal, and those are all, there's this big juncture between these three factors, which are making life very difficult for migrants or people within Senegal. And what are their responses to that? Is it always migration? What are their responses, right? So the research questions are really that guided and continue to guide my research are like, what are local communities' experiences of Spain's co-development with Senegal and the management of irregular migration from Senegal? And what is the daily experiences, routine of youths living in a highly mobile transit country, right? So whilst you've also got this migration from Senegal towards the Canary Islands, you've also got a lot of these fisher folk within the Langue de Barbarie. So it's if you have been to Senegal, and especially in Saint Louis, you will know that there are a lot of artisanal fisher folk, right? A lot of these fisher folk, for numerous reasons, have been migrating to Mauritania, to a country named Mauritania, which is just a neighboring country. They'd spend up to 9 months over there and then spend 3 months. So this is what we call circular migration patterns, right? But then if you're not migrating to Spain, and if you're not migrating to Mauritania or the Gambia or other places, what is your daily life? And I think this is really what's important about anthropology. We investigate the daily, we investigate the routine and how people manage their lives, and what are the pressures that youth may experience from not migrating, being immobile, so to say, right? And that is it, right? So what does it actually mean to be immobile in a highly mobile society, right? So the theoretical framework that's guiding a lot of my research is Ruben Anderson's Illegality Incorporated, so Clandestine Migration and the Business of Bordering Europe, in which Anderson employs a multi-sited research methodology, i.e. between Spain and Senegal, to study globalization, inherent racism towards sub-Saharan African migrants within the EU, and obviously the business of bordering Europe, right? I think it's very important for us also to note that whether it be Gregory Feldman or Ruben Anderson, and a lot of these academics are kind of asking, but there is this business around bordering Europe. There is this business that is created by, othering the migrant, by making the migrant, causing fear around the migrant, right? And that obviously brings in a lot of resources from, perhaps the EU level, right? But why are we hyping up? What is the purpose of hyping everybody up, when if we think about it, and if we understand, and if we look at the data, the migration data, let's just talk statistics over here. A lot of the more migrants are actually migrating within a sub-regional level, as opposed to from the south to the north, right? The data can show you this. It's really just a minority compared to the numbers that are migrating within the continent between whether it be within West Africa or from West Africa to North Africa, why are we hyping it up? And so these are some of the questions that that Ruben Anderson is asking, right? Another thing that really is guiding me is Irving Goffman's stigma, which likens social interactions between people to a theoretical play in which community members, i.e., actors, people, have a predetermined role to play within society, and those who do not fulfill this role are actually sanctioned by the community, right? So they're stigmatized. And so, nowadays, if somebody is not seen as successful, especially the youth in Senegal, then they are stigmatized for it by the community members, right? And that social pressure as well can actually cause people to migrate, right? And so, which is also interesting because, kind of in dialogue between Ruben Anderson and Irving Goffman, is that they said, well, Irving Goffman is also, Anderson is saying that, the returned migrants, the deporting migrants is also a good way to deter people, because that also, when migrants return empty-handed, that causes social pressure on the migrants and then forces them actually to return back and say, I'll try and gain entry back, how can I say, take another boat to get back into Senegal, or rather into Europe, even though it's very dangerous, right? So, it's in as much as what it's seen as a success, it's actually also causing the social pressure, and these social factors are also putting pressure on people to migrate again and risk their lives, even after deportation, right? Social circuits as well. So care, is manifested through the constant flow of information, remittances, and transnational migrants. And this is by Kohler and Gross, who talk about these effective circuits, right? So it's, for example, sending remittances is not necessarily just a question of sending money, but it's also a form of care. It's a form of sharing information. And so, we're trying to think of remittances just as this economic element. There's also this care element. And a lot of people show that I love my mother because, but I can't necessarily provide for her in my country, but I'm going to go abroad and I'm going to send money home as a form of care. So my absence, yes, she will miss my absence, but at the same time, she will be living a better life. So this is one of the research sites, which is in West Africa. So this is a map of Saint Louis to the right over there. And this is really to the north of Senegal, with the border of Mauritania, right? And so that is pretty much where my research site is. And this is what we also call the Langue de Barbarie, right? Which is just a sand pit which stretches for about 30 kilometers, and is located between the Senegal River and the Atlantic Ocean. And the fisher folk are very important in this because, yes, since time immemorial, they've always been fishing. But they became involved in irregular migration from about 2006, and I'll expand on that, right? So, why the Langue de Barbarie? The Langue de Barbarie, as I was mentioning about the Lebu fisher folk, which are these artisanal fisher folk, in 2006 they became really like the spotlight of the world was put on them because a lot of you may remember from 2006 there were these images of these boats that were just going and landing on the Canary Islands, and these boats really were coming from Saint Louis, from Senegal, and as a result of these these boat landings, there were about roughly 30,000 people who arrived on the shorelines of the Canary Islands in 2006. And this led to Spain responding, right, by having external migration agreements between Senegal and Spain to halt migration, right? And so in 2010, migration was under control. And then in 2023, when I was in the field, there was this resurgence of irregular migration. And then also, something else that is very important to note is that in 2006, 2008, the EU and Senegal signed fishing agreements, right? And that really put a lot of pressure on the marine sources that exist in Senegal. And that is part of the reason why a lot of these fishermen, abandoned their fishing boats abandoned fishing, and then decided to start transporting migrants to the, to the Canary Islands, right? And so another thing also as well is that there was an artificial breach that was dug in Ganjo, which is also in the Langue de Barbarie, and that has caused a lot of ecological damage. Which you can, if you go there right now, you will see it, right? And so climate change is also manifesting itself in the form of rising sea levels, and that is causing a lot of damage to people's property, right? And this a lot the UN and other organizations have expressed concern about the rising sea levels in Saint Louis. And then, of course, I did speak about the oil and gas exploration, right? So if you look over there, this is basically the West African route, which is the primary maritime route towards the Canary Islands, right? So this stretch, right, is considered really the most dangerous route to reach the Canary Islands, right? So you have a lot of these fishermen who are loading people in boats, and then they are going towards the Canary Islands. But those boats were never really designed for those long distances, right? But of course, they say that this is the easier way to reach Europe, because if not, then you're just going to have to go through the desert, which is treacherous, right? And so both migration routes are actually dangerous, but a lot of the fishermen say that, oh, I know how to reach there because I'm an experienced fisherman. We can get you there within 2 weeks or less, right? So some of the preliminary outcomes, sorry, the preliminary outcomes that came from this research, right, is, I decided to group it into four big themes, which was social pressure, artisanal fisheries, and human migration and male youth aspirations, right? So one of the big things is that a lot of the youth are not acknowledged by community members, right? And that causes a lot of social pressure, because they feel that they are not fulfilling their social roles. Something else that is also important is that, because it's life is getting harder. There's what we call waithood, right? So youths are taking longer to become adults, right? And so when even though, for example, you've reached a certain age where you should be taking care of your family and all of that, you find that you're not necessarily at that stage. You're not an adult yet because you're not independent, and therefore that is extending the gap between youth and being an adult, and which obviously comes with a lot of benefits, and being seen as important within the community, right? And so there's definitely all of these stories of social media and how Europe looks. And that I was asking, is that what's driving migration to Europe? And they say, well, yes and no, because when a returned migrant builds a home, and is lavish, that's the constant reminder. The social media, we can see it and we can turn it off. But there, every day we're looking at the successful migrant, and so there's also this comparison between the two, between those who have migrated and those who haven't, right? A lot of people, also spoke about, for example, the rising cost of living within artisanal fisheries, right? Fuel is becoming more expensive. They have to spend more time out at sea in order to catch more fish. But that is in and of itself is dangerous, because you have to go deeper into sea. And, a lot of people are also dying at sea. So whether they're dying while trying to reach the Canary Islands or practicing their livelihood, it is dangerous, right? And it's becoming more dangerous, right? And something else that also, that youth spoke about is that when they go on these 9-month trips to Mauritania, within 3 months of returning, they broke again, and then they have to repeat it. And it's really hard work. I think that is also something that I want to highlight, is that this is very physical labor. It's artisanal fishing, and for the amount of work that they're doing, they say, I can work less harder in Europe, but get more, right? And have more to show for it, right? So one thing I did notice as well is when I was I was doing like observations, and I was looking at the Spanish, and I saw the Spanish Guardia in Ganjol, which is along the San Luis. Was also interesting to notice that a lot of people now are a lot more silent about migration. There's a lot of mistrust, because they know that people are that they are being surveyed, monitored, the discussions, because they're really trying to stop migration, right? So you don't know who you can trust. So therefore, talking to people, who I didn't know, was really difficult. They just didn't want to talk about it, or they just be secret, about it. So there's also the thing of, the commodification of bodies, right? People are just loading these boats, to make money. And so migration in and of itself, even though, for example, we have these what you call these laws that are stopping migration, it is also important for us to know that it's not stopping it in and of itself. People are just going to go and look for alternate routes. But of course, that makes it difficult because when you look for when you go further south in Senegal, it means you have to go further up, right? But people are still going to pay. And there are a lot of people who are saying, well, if you're bored, we will take you, but you have to pay. So, it's just basically the commodification of bodies that is taking place. And so there were also, a lot of questions about the supernatural and everything else that arose. There's also religious considerations, right? The male youth aspirations, I'm focusing mainly on male youth because those are the people who I have access to. A lot of them, and I'll just run through this very quickly, feel the need to show that they, to be loyal to their mothers, right? A lot of them say that, their fathers, because when they earn the money, they have to give their money to their parents. But the fathers, some of them are basically using the money irresponsibly, looking for a second or third wife, but they can't even look after the first wife. And so the mothers are really looking, have to work hard. They have to look after the family and look, how can I say, take on another job, be very entrepreneurial and get money, right? So the desire is definitely for youths to look after their mothers so that they don't have to work as hard, right? So the discourse on migrants in Africa, this is also very important. There is a culture of migration in West Africa. Migration is seen as a rite of passage, right? If you migrate, you are a man. And therefore, in as much as we have these policies, a lot of people saying, well, it doesn't matter how hard it gets, because if I'm going through tests, then could be seen as a test from the Almighty. And God is with me during this trip, so, and even if I die, whilst reaching it, at least I died trying. I will be considered as a martyr, as opposed to just sitting down. So these questions of religion, of culture, of mobility have always existed, right? And I think that these are the limitations of push and pull factors, because push and pull factors don't consider the visa regimes in place, right? And it also doesn't consider limitations on mobility as well as global inequalities and cultural factors, right? And so going forward, I'm focusing on the spoken discourse on and among non-migrants, right? So Hilary Dick's article, Imagined Lives and Modernist Chronotypes in Mexican Non-Migrant Discourse, she looks at the spoken discourse among people in Uriaganto, Mexico, and how people talk about migration and the imaginaries of a life beyond here. And so there's this binary between the global north and the global south. And the US is deemed as this place of economic prosperity and mobility, but also as moral disillusion. And Mexico is viewed as economic stagnation, and yet is the land for space, of family, and morality. So people kind of negotiate between the two. It's like, do I stay here or do I go? And, it's this negotiation really that makes people decide to migrate or not. And this is something also similar in Senegal, right? That if I decide to migrate, am I still going to be morally acceptable? What happens if I stay? So there's this dialogue of how, Senegal is, a lot of people in Senegal view Europe, but there's also this discourse about Europe as not necessarily being the place of family and good morals. So in terms of the next steps, I hope to return to Spain to conduct a preliminary field site visit and reconnect with community members that I met in Senegal, that I met in Spain, namely that youth that I met and his friends. And then also I want to when I return to Senegal, I need to really think about strategies to account for the silence and secrecy around migration. So yeah, I hope I didn't spend too much time, but yes, there's, comments, questions, suggestions. I'm happy and open to them. Thank you.